freedom lovers, fellow armchair philosophers, and anyone still holding on to their beanie babies for investment purposes. Greetings. And since we are discussing Spanish influence on the United States today, let me say buenos tardes a todos. There's a little gringo Spanish for all of you out there. Yes, that's how I speak it, and I'm not ashamed of it. As always, it is I, your favorite undocumented, conservative social studies teacher, who knows approximately 3% more than the typical high school textbook, Mr. Palumbo, and this is the Professor Liberty Podcast. Thank you for tuning in, folks. You know I appreciate it. The tens and tens of you out there, you faithful followers across the fruited plain and even to the oceans beyond, thank you very much for listening. Today we're going to dive into the Cowboys. Yes, no, not the Dallas Cowboys. Who cares about them? We're going to talk about the European origins of the American cowboy, most specifically that of the Spanish influence of the American cowboy. If you'd like to email the show, the email is professorliberty1776 at gmail.com. That's professorliberty1776 at gmail.com. Send me your thoughts, your words, your deeds, your criticisms, your concerns, your applications, your demonstrations, your abominations, whatever you want, ladies and gentlemen. You just have to send it to professorliberty1776 at gmail.com. Even if it's a small, weird, quirky idea, a lot of the podcast material comes from you, the listener. You guys engage with me on Facebook. You engage on X. Well, nobody really engages on X. All they do is yell at each other. But these conversations that we have, these emails that I get, all sometimes you never know what happens. It kind of goes into the fertile crevasses of my mind and something comes out and it's a podcast episode. So don't hesitate to email me, hit me up on Facebook, and you never know. Your idea might turn into a show that rhyme. Okay, so last week, Secretary of State Marco Rubio gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference. And I'm not going to lie to you guys, I had no idea such a conference existed. Sure, I've heard of the G10 or the G20. I've heard of those things. You know, I didn't know there was a Munich Security Conference. I guess there's one every year, every February. And since it's talking about security, they get together, the political elites gather in Munich, and they argue about, policy and deterrence and war. They talk about intelligence and foreign alliance, balance of power. And this is where the United States Secretary of State Marco Rubio took the stage and began talking about cowboys. It probably caught people off guard. He wasn't talking about missiles or drones or NATO expansion. No, he was talking about cowboys. Now, to be fair, the speech wasn't only about cowboys. I'm being a little provocative there. That's about as provocative as I get, ladies and gentlemen. No, he was mostly talking in the context of Western culture, Western civilization, and the undeniable connection between Western Europe and the United States. And I highly recommend this speech. It was a very good speech. In part of the speech, he said, quote, "We are part of one civilization, Western civilization. We are bound to one another by the deepest bonds that nations could share, forged by centuries of shared history, Christian faith, culture, heritage, language, ancestry, and the sacrifices our forefathers made together," unquote. Now, he got a standing ovation for this speech. It's about a 25-minute speech. But it's a great speech. Anybody that follows this show, anybody that knows me, knows I was all about it. I know a lot of us are black-pilled out there, and we see the current events happening and what's going on, and we're just depressed. And I shared on Facebook the Rubio speech, and I had some comments about it, and I got a lot of comments back saying, "Yeah, well, he's probably the one redacted on the Epstein list, or we can't trust the elites." I know, guys. I know. Okay, I know. But we have to sometimes separate the person from what is being said. At least these things are being said. It might be too late. But at least some of our leaders are speaking in a way that they understand the current crisis. Is Western civilization on its way out? Are we done? Is this the final chapter? Are we living in the final chapter? I don't know. But as the famous Rocky Balboa said, "I don't hear no bell." And until we hear the bell, we got to keep fighting and clawing and scraping and sharing these ideas. And perhaps it'll spark a renaissance, a revolution, a rebirth. Anyways, back to the speech. So in the speech, he talks about horses and cowboys. And he says, quote, "Our horses, our ranches, our rodeos, the entire romance of the cowboy archetype that became synonymous with the American West was born in Spain," unquote. Now, just today, I don't know if she said it yesterday or today, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, speaking of Spanish influence, but we'll stop there. She kind of tried to mock Marco Rubio, another Latino, by the way. So now we have Latino on Latino violence. But okay. I'm all over the place, folks. I'm all over the place. Anyway, she goes on to mock Rubio, or try to mock Rubio, and she says, Spain didn't bring the cowboy. It was the Mexicans, and it was the former slaves that made the cowboy. But in a room filled with defense ministers, military strategists, politicians, political leaders, elected officials, what Rubio said here about horses and cowboys and Spain is powerful. Before the United States even existed, before Texas and the cowboy with the big hat, before the myths of the frontier, before the silhouettes of the cowboy riding off into the proverbial sunset, and dare I say, before Mexico and before New Spain, there was Spain. So I thought I would take this opportunity to do a podcast on the American cowboy, one of the most iconic symbols in the American West and in American culture. And I want to talk about Spain's influence on the American cowboy. And it first starts with the horses, just as Marco Rubio mentioned. Now, scientists claim that there was a native horse species in North America. It was smaller than the European cousin, but that horse went extinct thousands of years ago. And by the time of Columbus in 1492, when he arrived in the Americas were horseless. There was not a horse. And in world history class, we've been discussing this. I love it when it all ties together. We've been discussing the age of exploration and something historians call the Columbian Exchange. Now, of all the revolutions, right, the Industrial Revolution, we've been talking about that on the podcast a lot lately, the Protestant Reformation, the Renaissance, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, it's probably very easy to make the point that the Columbian Exchange should probably be called the Columbian Revolution. So many things are going to change in our world because one guy took 3 small ships and landed in the Bahamas 530 some odd years ago. The Columbian Exchange was a massive transfer of plants, animals, and people, but also technologies and disease from the New World to the Old World. Think about it. Cattle, pigs, sheep were all introduced to the Americas from Europe. At that time, Europeans got new food like maize, potatoes, tomatoes. I mean, think about it. Rome. Think about Rome. Think about Italy. Italy existed without tomatoes. Like, that just boggles the modern mind. And also, horses were on that list. It was explorers and settlers from Spain in the 16th century who brought horses to the Americas. Horses were shipped to the Caribbean and then to Mexico, and then gradually pushed northward into what would be called New Spain. That reintroduction was revolutionary. The horse didn't just add mobility, it shaped entire civilizations. Spanish ranching culture moved north from Mexico into what we now know as Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California. And it came with sophisticated, highly organized system of cattle management, which the Spanish had refined over centuries. Large herds moved across vast ranches, and that required careful planning, coordinated teams of mounted herdsmen or cowhands, or eventually cowboys, and specialized equipment. Now we have to enter the vaquero, the mounted herdman who would become the blueprint for the American cowboy. The vaquero's life revolved around the cattle, handling, driving, roping, branding. They had to know how to crack the whip, toss the lasso, maneuver in the saddle, right? And this was honed over generations. Even the language of ranching carries this mark. The word vaquero comes from vaca, which in Spanish means cow, and the Anglo word buckaroo actually derives from this Spanish vaquero. English-speaking settlers arriving later borrowed not just the word, but the culture that it represented. But the influence goes beyond language. The vaqueros introduced the wide brim sombrero for sun protection, the thick chaps for riding through brush, the saddle design that allowed for long hours on horseback, all of which became integral part of what Americans now recognize as cowboy culture. The reintroduction of the horse also greatly impacted the indigenous North Americans. The horse transformed the Plains Indians. Mobility increased exponentially. Hunting changed. Warfare changed. Trade networks changed. Among those nations was one legendary, the Comanche. The Comanche mastered the horse with incredible speed, and they arguably became the most formidable mounted power in North America. Their horsemanship rivaled that of the mounted archers in the Assyrian Empire, ancient warriors who once dominated Mesopotamia. And like those ancient cavalry forces, the Comanche turned mobility into dominance. They could ride low on the flank of a galloping horse. They could fire arrows with deadly accuracy. And white expansion west, particularly in Texas, was repeatedly stifled because of the sheer lethality of the Comanche warriors. I've probably told this story 1,000 times. You know, as you get up there in podcasts, you guys are going to hear me say things over and over. I've probably said this in my First Americans series way back in the day, but I even share this in class. The Comanche warrior, the mounted Comanche warrior, could get off at least 3 arrows with deadly precision, while the white settlers were clumsily trying to get off one shot with their cumbersome muskets. But it's not just about Comanche mastery. Once European settlers and soon former slaves moved west, the land became a testing ground for skill, ingenuity, and independence. The Spanish vaqueros tradition, horsemanship, cattle management, and a code of respect and skill merged with the reality of the American plains, and this is the tapestry upon which the American cowboy is sewn together and created. Now, the cowboy's life, though we romanticize it in our John Wayne movies, wasn't that exciting, and it was very grueling, right? Cattle drives, branding, long days on horseback, which demanded self-reliance and courage. A cowboy's day began when the sun rose, and it often didn't end until after sunset. The work was relentless, herding cattle across hundreds of miles, navigating rough terrain, and keeping the herd together in all weather. The food was simple, practical, and often repetitive. Cowboys ate what could be easily preserved and you could travel with, right? So things like salted meats and tack, very similar to what the sailors ate, that hard biscuit. Sometimes they would have dried fruit. And of course, the infamous cowboy coffee. The pay was modest. Most cowhands earned around $25 to $40 per month, most times less. Though the work demanded skill, stamina, and courage far beyond what the paycheck might suggest, to put it in perspective, a factory worker in the late 1800s might make $50 or $60 a month. A school teacher could make around $30 to $50 a month. So while cowhands were performing this very dangerous labor on horseback for weeks at a time, they were often earning less than someone in a small town. And this is one of my favorite stats. I've said this before. I share this a lot when we talk about the Wild West in history class. Approximately 1 in 4 cowboys, American cowboys, were black, were African. Approximately 25% of American cowboys were black Americans. These former slaves and freemen brought their skills, innovation, and strength to the American West. And among these pioneers was the inventor of bulldogging, a man named William Bill Pickett, a black cowboy from Texas who transformed the rough and tumble work of the cattle ranch into a daring performing art. Bulldogging is where you come alongside the steer, you leap off your horse in such a way as you jump onto its neck, and you can grab its horns and bring it to the ground. You want to talk about some alpha male type stuff. This takes the cake. Pickett developed his technique from leaping off the horse and onto the steer, wrestling it to the ground at Wild West shows, captivating the audiences around the country. And now his innovations have become a template for modern steer wrestling, a cornerstone event in rodeos across the United States. So you see, boys and girls, ladies and gentlemen, the American cowboy is not the product of a single culture. Its creation is a story unto itself, and one that also aligns with the American story. It starts with Spanish settlers who brought horses, and later the vaqueros and the Mexicans who brought their horsemanship, as well as the white and black cowboys who built upon those models to bring us the cowboys that we know and celebrate today. And let's not also forget the American Indian who took the horse to its limit. I mean, if any people could manipulate and exploit the purposes of an animal, it would be the American Indian and the Comanche. They were not just horsemen, they were horse masters. And yet all this ties us back to our Western European roots, the civilization, the language, the culture that crossed the Atlantic to lay the foundations of the United States. English settlers brought the concept of common law, representative government, and parliamentary tradition. The Germans brought work ethic, craftsmanship. And of course, the Spanish introduced horses, ranching culture, and the code of skill and honor that shapes the cowboy archetype that we all love today. So it's not like the Marxists want you to believe, boys and girls. It's not a white versus black, white versus brown people. It's not oppressor versus oppressed. The cowboy, in all its myth, in all its reality, is a tapestry of Mexican, black, indigenous contributions to that element. But first and foremost, it is of the Spanish. Without the Spanish influence, without the horse, without the traditions, without the vaqueros, you would not have the American cowboy as we know him today. Here at Professor Liberty, we seek to educate, inspire, and restore. If you like this podcast, please go to Apple Podcasts and give me a 5-star rating. You could do me even better if you give me a written review. Please go to www.professorliberty.com where you can get the Proclaiming Liberty blog. You can sign up for an email subscription. You can also go to teacherspayteachers.com and you can buy worksheets and lessons and activities that Mr. Palumbo himself has made. So if you want to support, if you like what you hear, support Professor Liberty and go to teacherspayteachers.com. Until next time, go throughout the land and proclaim liberty.